And beyond. Thank you for having us. We have a fabulous lineup of talks and events. If you know this festival, you know it's good. So here on the main stage, there will be lots going on. I just want to just test your vocal cords and hands one more time. Let's give it up for the incredible local team that make this festival happen, Margot Adler and her crew. And let's give it up for the volunteers. So we have in this next session 2 speakers for you tonight. A little later on at 8:45 we will have a great debate in this room on this stage. It is going to be a hoot. So be sure to come back for that. But first up, we've got 2 of Australia's most acclaimed and most intrepid scientists. We have Professor Mike Archer with us from the University of New South Wales. He is a paleontologist, he is a seasoned public communicator, he is a provocateur, I would add. He is past director of the esteemed institution, the Australian Museum in Sydney. He's former Dean of Science at UNSW, which is the university he resides at now, and countless other roles, too many to name. But his work focuses on the deep past, extraordinary fossils in extraordinary places here in Australia, and also on the fragile present. So looking at the ways in which the tools of science might revive some of the species we're on the cusp of losing, or indeed species that we have lost already. Is that even possible? He also, a little known fact, has a new phosphate mineral named after him, archerite. And when the geologist explained the origins of that fossil, of that mineral, beg your pardon, it turned out to be mutated batshit. So I love that story. His favourite things about Tassie are Gilston Bay. Some people say Gilston, I gather. What's the vote? Gilston? Gilston? Gilston. Because that's the person it's named after, yes? Yeah, I thought so. Tiger quolls at Cradle Mountain. Who's seen one? Yeah, beautiful. He's had a pet quoll too. The Styx Forest, who's been there and looked up? Glorious. And everything to do with thylacines. To talk on sex, songs and the sponge, Australia's Guinness Book of Evolutionary Records, please welcome to the Beaker Street at TMAG stage, Professor Mike Archer.
Thank you, Natasha. And thank you for mentioning that archerite and the mutated batshit. I was honoured when that happened until that guy explained to me that's what it was. But anyway, I still feel pretty good about it. I'm not actually going to talk about a lot of the things that Natasha just said. What I'm going to talk about is the fact that it's depressing that the Northern Hemisphere seems to think that everything ratchet and tired and old ends up in Australia, that nothing exciting has ever happened here. And if any of you have any aspirations for becoming teachers, you've got to rubbish that ridiculous idea and realize Australia was the start of some of the most exciting things that ever happened on planet Earth. This is the problem here. I think this is what the rest of the world seems to think about Australia. They're all scared shitless about us. You know, we got the most poisonous snake in the world. That one's called the Paradoxia microlepidota. The locals call it the one ciggy snake, because if you get bitten by it, you got time for one cigarette and you drop dead. And that seems to be generally the overview about why anybody would be not want to come to Australia. And it's just ridiculous. Okay, I'm going to rattle through this, and if I don't get through it quickly enough, we won't be able to ask any questions about it. So here I go. First, Australia is the first place on planet Earth where you could actually stand on something. So right after planet Earth formed, you've got, at 4.45, zircon crystals forming in the rocks of the planet Earth. And the oldest zircon crystal, the oldest anything on planet Earth, is Australian. So this was the beginning of everything. The oldest life on planet Earth, the oldest undoubted life, comes from Western Australia, Shark Bay. These are stromatolites. We know what they're like because there's still some surviving in Shark Bay. But the first evidence of life of any kind comes from the rocks in Western Australia. Boom, boom. The first and only known cells from the same period, this is actual organic cells, are also known from Australia. Leaves the rest of the world for dead. Yeah, they don't look particularly exciting, but hey, that's the beginning, the first cells. No one else has got them, we do. This gets weird. If you're not sort of quite sure about some of those squiggly cells, this is the next oldest organism that anybody has ever seen. It's 3.4 billion years old, comes from the Strelley Pool Formation in Western Australia, and nobody has a clue what it is, except that it's an organism of some weird kind. And I think the clues to try to figure out what this thing is to think about the rolling stones that are coming out of these rocky hills that are producing it. Ta-da! I can't get no petrifaction. How do you go past that? How do you go past that? Coincidence? I definitely don't think so. Here's the next one. Our bodies are made up of a special kind of cell called a eukaryotic cell. It's a cell that has its chromosomes all tucked up in a nucleus. Those bacteria things, the blue-green algae, they don't. Their chromosomes are spread all through the cell. It's kind of a primitive cell. So when did the first eukaryotic cells turn up? And here's the key bit. Eukaryotic cells are characterized, all the cells of our body, by sexual reproduction. This is the beginning of sex on planet Earth. And there it is. The oldest known eukaryotic cell on Earth comes from the Northern Territory, 1.49 billion years old, from the Roper River group. And you think that's the first organism that indulged in sex on planet Earth, and they did it in Australia, and you think, no thanks. So I'll give you a bit of a hand here. If that makes it any more appealing, go for it. The oldest animal, the oldest evidence of animals, comes again from Western Australia. People talk about Australia being the oldest continent on the Earth, and it's not true. The reality is all the continents are about the same age, but the difference is Australia has had much of the younger rocks eroded away, so more of these older, exciting rocks are exposed here. And in Western Australia, this crazy little pimple there called the Stirling Ranges actually produces rocks like this, and it looks like structures like this in the sandstones there. It looks like what you'd see if you walk along a beach, and there's a little worm in the sand, and it's coming up, and it doesn't want to be seen, so it's foraging out in the sand, looking for nice little tasty little bacteria to eat or whatever. And it's been interpreted to be the first evidence of an animal. But if that doesn't push your button, you come to Ediacara in the Flinders Ranges, and there's all these strange things turning up here at 570 million years. That's about 500 million years old. What are they? There's been huge arguments about this. And in fact, one Australian soil pedologist has argued that these are shriveled lichens, and he's made everybody else furious because they look like weird kinds of unfamiliar animals, but not lichens. Anyway, big debate about this. Here's a reconstruction of what some of these things looked like. You got weird things like frangipani monsters, pull chain toilet monsters. We don't know what these things are, but it's the first thing that animals did on planet Earth when they began to diversify and realize there was a planet to take over. And they didn't produce things that we're familiar with. This is the first big bloom of animal diversity. But look at this guy, Dickinsonia. Big arguments about what that is. Some people said it's, again, a shriveled lichen. Other people thought, well, maybe it's some kind of freaky out worm. Well, recently, one of these Dickinsonia things that actually came from Russia, but hey, they're better known here in Australia, has been examined, and it turned out to actually have organic material associated with it. What was the organic material? Cholesterol, fat. And only animals have cholesterol. So this is inarguably evidence that those crazy Ediacaran things are actually the first animals on planet Earth. There's no doubt about it. And it may also mean that becoming a couch potato started first in Australia, because fat organisms were here first. The oldest... Okay, I'm glad that was appreciated. And he wasn't even overweight. Yeah, there you go. Okay. Australia also has produced the oldest bony fish. No mouths on these crazy things, but they're covered in scales. This is coming from the Stairway Sandstone in Northern Territory, about 500 million years old here, 480 million. And it has unmistakably a good fish body. This is a reconstruction, a reasonable one, of what these things look like. This is the oldest fish on planet Earth. And some people just have too much time on their hands. Somebody out there on the web demonstrated they actually knitted one, in case you were doubted, wondering what they looked like. what was the first animal to actually come out of the oceans and wonder what was on planet Earth, on the continents? And this was the usual Gary Johnson explanation. Somebody batted a baseball out and they had to go out and retrieve it. That's not what happened. What happened, and again it comes from Western Australia, 400 million years old, in the sandstones there. There are trackways, and there's no question about it. They were made by Eurypterids. These are marine scorpions. They're the ancestors of today's land scorpions. That's the first time an animal strayed out of the oceans to see what was out on the land, and it happened in Australia. The first evidence of forests are Australian. And this comes from a place in Wee Jasper, 400 million years old, and the rocks are demonstrating enormous root systems, indicating they were supporting huge trees up above. Again, first forests in Australia. We've already said sex started in Australia, and that's nice enough. We could even roll with that one. But what about sexual... I have to look at the vintages here. Fingers in ears of anybody you don't want to hear this. But what about sexual intercourse? You know, actually, if you're going to be an animal on land, you can't sort of just hope your gametes find each other. You've got to actually put them where they got to go. So where did sexual intercourse first start? Was it dinosaurs? The answer is no. Again, Australian fish do it. If you've ever turned a shark upside down and seen the males have these claspers at the back, and the claspers are what they use to intromit the sperm into the female shark. Well, these placoderms, studied by John Long, unmistakably had rigid claspers going out to the side. They weren't flexible. The only way this would work is they actually have to square dance. They stand up side to side like boot scooting, poke their little Duverlackey, you know, left and right, and that was the beginning of sexual intercourse on planet Earth, and it happened in Australia. The longest surviving labyrinthodont, these are kind of like giant stretched frogs. They're the ancestors of not only a lot of the amphibians, but some of the reptiles. And it's in Victoria, 120 million years old. And this gigantic thing that's here, it's about 5 meters long, survived longer than anywhere else, because at that point, at this time, we're talking here 120 million years old, Australia was within the Antarctic Circle, and it was very cold. And the argument is crocodiles hadn't moved these guys out. So here they survived longer than anywhere else. This is a possible explanation. Again, the weird things you find on the web when you're out there, it's just amazing. Somebody baked a cake to show you what this labyrinthodont looked like. This is another one. The guy who actually lost his arm to that crocodile has Australia to thank for the fact that the modern Australian, or the modern crocodiles of the world first evolved here. Isisfordia in Queensland, 100 million years ago, is the first of the whole range of crocodiles that then populated the rest of planet Earth. It happened here. You can't talk about these sort of things without asking where are the biggest dinosaurs on planet Earth. And usually, I hope there's no Texans in the room, so I'm not insulting anybody, but they just want to keep claiming it happened in Texas. You know, you have supersauruses and oh my gosh, myosauruses, and I can't believe them-osauruses, all coming out of Texas. And yes, here's Jim Jensen standing next to the arm of a brachiosaur from Texas. They were big. The question is, were they the biggest dinosaurs in the world? Did the biggest dinosaurs in the world come from Texas? One of them did. No question about it. George W. Bush. Unfortunately, he's near extinction. That's all right. But as you come south out of the Northern Hemisphere, dinosaurs mysteriously got bigger. This is a thing that the North Americans don't talk too much about. But in South America, the dinosaurs included things like Giganotosaurus here, Giga big noto southernsaurus lizard, that were bigger than T-Rex. Doesn't get much of a mention in the old popular literature. And they were gobbling up gigantic sauropods like Argentinosaurus that were bigger than all those, oh my gosh, myosauruses coming out of Texas. But is that the biggest dinosaurs in the world? The answer is no. Comes back to Australia again. Just north of Broome, in the sandstone stretch between Broome and the Kimberley, there are deposits that are 130 million years old, and here's a single track in this trackway that is 1.75 meters in diameter. That is so, I can't put my arms out that wide. That is bigger than any dinosaur known in the whole world. Unfortunately, what we've got are these giant tracks. And if you spring from one footprint to another and hope you're going to end up with a giant pile of bones at the end of it, you get nothing for your troubles but a mouthful of sand, because you run into all the West Australian sand dunes. So the skeletons that support this haven't been found, but there's no argument that Australia had the biggest ones, and those deposits in the Kimberley also had the highest dinosaur diversity of anywhere in the world. 21 different kinds of dinosaur footprints are found in those sandstones. We also had, Jurassic Park. Of course, it was ridiculous. If Michael Crichton had just asked one paleontologist and said, is that thing we're reconstructing here a velociraptor, they all would have said, no. Velociraptor's about the size of a naughty dog. If it really annoyed you, you just kick it in the butt. That they were actually talking about something like Utah raptor. But all these raptors were ferocious things with those big claws on the hind foot that they could dismantle anything. And there's no question about it again. The first megaraptors happened in Australia, and they came from Lightning Ridge. That's the oldest and earliest one we know about. In a place called Murgon, southeast Queensland, we're coming up in time now. We've been working a deposit since 1983 that's 55 million years old. That's just before Australia pulled away from Antarctica. So it's really interesting. All the marsupials there, they smell of enchiladas and tacos and hot chili sauce. They're all South American kinds of marsupials, not surprisingly, because they could walk back and forth. But in the same deposits, we found songbirds. And that, by about 20 million years old, is older than any songbirds known in the rest of the world. The North Americans hate this. They wanted songbirds and beautiful tweets. Oh, let me think about that. Better tweets than the ones that are coming out of North America at the moment. But they really hoped that North America would be the origin of songbirds, and it isn't. It was Australia where songbirds started. And Sue Hand is here. You can talk with her later. Technically, the oldest bat comes from Australia. And we've said to the people in Murgon, it's a tiny, sleepy little town in southeast Queensland, and it's not famous for an awful lot. And we said, you could put a giant sign on the town as you come in and say, Murgon, the home of the oldest bat. And they don't seem interested in that. I don't know why. Riversley, a place we've been working since 1976, about 43 years, documents the last 24 million years of Australian history, and it's quite extraordinary. It collaborates with research being done by people all around Australia, but it's a particularly rich record from here. And we have weird things coming out of this, all kinds of different marsupial lions, thylacines, bats. We even have the world's oldest sperm cells, bizarrely. 17 million-year-old sperm cells with nuclei inside them are turning up in those fossil deposits. But we even had drop crocs. These are crocs that were not content to be in the water. These were climbing trees. You didn't have to worry. It's not, that Crocodile Dundee thing where you worry about filling your canteen in the river. You didn't have to worry about that. You had to worry about what was over your head because the crocodiles were dropping out of the trees on prey. So we had some pretty weird stuff coming out of those fossil deposits. And even, here's a kangaroo, actually, which has gotten the name Fangaroo. This is a kangaroo that has giant canines like a wolf. It's an example of one of the things that happened in Riversley. We started finding a piece of jaw here, and actually Sue was the author describing the name of the thing, Nimodon laveracorum. But we didn't know what the whole animal looked like, and we assumed it was something like this, a terrestrial marsupial roaming around the rainforest 15 million years ago in herds. And it turns out when Karen Black started to really study this, when we got whole skeletons, that this looks more like, it's got claws, more like a koala on steroids. They're gigantic claws, and the arms are powerful. And the answer is we were wrong. It's actually hanging upside down. These are marsupial sloths that had herds up in the trees over your head. And these were drop bears, because periodically they lost their grip, fortunately, and landed in a cave, and that's how we found these fossils. So we even had drop bears as well as drop crocs. The biggest pythons in the world. These are 10 meters long pythons, amazing. Here's a vertebra here of an Indian reticulated python. That's the biggest python in the world today, and that gets to be about 8 meters is big. That turned up in Riversley, and what's even stranger about that vertebra is that the central part of it does not have a fused cap on it. It means it's a baby. So we don't even know how big these things got. Birds. This thing, Dromornis, is actually the biggest bird that ever developed anywhere in the world. You can forget the Madagascan birds and the New Zealand birds. This is a monstrous bird. And we're talking here about 4 meters high, nearly 10,000 pounds or 500 kilograms in weight. And it's really weird. The anatomy of the head says they're somehow related to ducks, as strange as this is. They're unique to Australia, biggest birds in the world. And here's, by size comparison, that's the biggest bird we've got in Australia today is the cassowary. So it gives you some idea how enormous these birds were. And even stranger, Steve Rowe, studying them, says he thinks, from the anatomy of the head, that they were at least partly carnivorous. So it wasn't long before they got the nickname the Demon Ducks of Doom. Fascinating. Again, only Australia. You know, we love the scrat. If you've seen the Ice Age movies, how do you resist that? It's the real sweetie of all of those movies, but it's wonderful science fiction, isn't it? A saber-toothed rat. Well, it's not. We found this thing in rivers, and look at this thing. Here's the rock. Okay, I did add the nose, and I did add the eyeball, but look, it's a giant saber-toothed bandicoot. And if we hadn't already named this, Kenny Trevelyan had named the thing Galati speciosus, we really should be calling that Thylacoscratus, you know, but give us time. What's the smartest, biggest, most ferocious specialized carnivore in the world today? Most people would immediately put up their hand and say a lion. But the answer is no, it's not true. It's our marsupial lions in Australia. These got to be like 160 kilos in weight, so you're right into the African lion size. They had a bigger brain than an African lion. They had huge thumb claws with vicious can openers on the end of them, and powerful, powerful lower teeth for tearing your throat out, premolars that were like bolt-cutting teeth. There has never been a carnivore, a mammalian carnivore, anywhere, anytime, as weird and specialized as these Australian marsupial lions. So they're precious to us. And I should say, those of you who do know that we have an interest in trying to de-extinct extinct things, it has been more than of interest to some of us that a recent skeleton of a marsupial lion found in a cave on the Nullarbor has been found with organic stains all around it. And the thought that it might have DNA, and that we could get this DNA back, and put marsupial lions back into Australia. Think how exciting that would make camping trips, you know. You wouldn't have to worry about the odd rogue kangaroo, man. They had other problems here. The largest, most venomous animal on planet Earth also is Australian. Megalania. It's a goanna. It's a gigantic goanna, 7 meters long. And we know, because goannas today do have venom, we know this will make this the largest, most venomous animal, regardless of any other kind of thing it is, on planet Earth. The next biggest one would be the Komodo dragon. And note the fact Komodo dragons, like all goannas, have forked tongues. And that reminds you of their relationship to snakes, and it's not surprising to find they got venom. But at any rate, it's also the biggest lizard in the world. I'm coming around the last corners here, and I think I'm going to make it. The Yanks keep saying, and even Wiki keeps saying, that the tallest trees on planet Earth are these coastal redwoods in California. And yes, they are big, 115 meters tall. But Wiki says they're the tallest trees on Earth. I don't understand how Wiki can be that wrong. It turns out, right here in Tasmania and Victoria, mountain ash trees are infinitely bigger. They're known to be 17 meters taller than what was that? That was a California redwood screaming. That's not true. It's not true. It is true. The mountain ash trees are the tallest trees in the world. So North America, just get over it. We visited Muir Woods in California at one point, where all these beautiful redwoods are in that forest. And there was this sign that said, you know, welcome to the forest of the biggest trees in the world. And I was annoyed about this. And I went up, rapped on the door of the guy there who was interpreting this for everybody, and said, hey, you know, that's not true. The, you know, Eucalyptus regnans in Australia and in Victoria and Tasmania is much bigger than that. And he looked at me, you know, sort of ground his teeth and sort of said, oh, yeah? Well, what do you want me to do about it? So the sign is still there. They just won't accept the fact that we have the tallest trees in the world. The oldest things on planet Earth. They usually go for the bristlecone pines again in North America. And yes, some of them are nearly 5,000 years old. That's pretty old. Forget it. In Australia, we have Neptune grass, a seagrass, that's estimated, individual plants, to be 100,000 years old. Individual plants, and they're 8 kilometers in diameter, weighing 6,000 tons. I mean, that is old. But that's not the oldest. Right here in Tasmania, this plant, the king's holly, Lomatia tasmanica, found by this wonderful man, Charles King, climbing a mountain in Tasmania, and he realized this was something nobody'd seen before. As it's been studied, it's now clear that individual trees are 135,000 years old. So bristlecone kinds are just tiny little whippersnappers. They don't count. And even a piece of one of these trees back along the trunk was radiocarbon dated at 43,600 years. So we have the oldest trees, for sure. We also have the longest living animal of any kind on planet Earth, the Australian lungfish. This one, not this guy. And here, from Lightning Ridge, these teeth are 100 million years old. It's the same species. It can't be distinguished from the Queensland lungfish. No species on Earth, other than this one, is that long, that long. And in California, they even have the oldest fish in captivity in a kind of a natural environment turns out to be an Australian lungfish, and that individual fish is 90 years old, so they're pretty happy about that. Not all these records are things we necessarily feel proud about. Where's the ugliest animal on planet Earth? How do you go past the blobfish, for goodness sake? I mean, half of the massive, and none of this is Photoshopped. That's what they look like when you bring them up. You know, only a mother, I didn't even think a mother could love that thing. But, you know, okay, they give us another record maybe we're not that happy about. The last point I want to make, where's the animal with the smallest brain on planet Earth? And here's some grand candidates, man. What is wrong with that man who's holding a sardine in front of a saltwater crocodile? What is wrong with that guy's brain? It has to be very tiny. And it's so much for that penguin, you know. At any rate, it goes on. And I love this one. What's the capital of Texas? T. How do you go past that? But that's none of those. They're just candidates. They didn't win. The winner? Koala. I'm sorry. The koala, despite those beautiful eyes and that nice cuddly demeanor, has a brain that doesn't even bother to fill up the brain case it's got. If you take a koala and gently shake it, you hear bada 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 bada. That's the brain going back and forth inside that head. And if you look deeply into those big brown eyes, your look goes right out through the back of the head because there's nothing on the way to stop it. And I think this comes from spending 30 million years gobbling up eucalyptus leaves, not a recommended food strategy. Thank you very much.
Where else would we live, Mike Archer? Where else would we be? We've got a few minutes for some questions, or if you'd like to ask them. Got any questions? Hands up. Yes, thank you. I'm just going to do the run around. Oh, sorry. That would have done Heath's ear. Is he in? This is Heath from the ABC. He heads up operations in the Hobart operations at the ABC.
Hey, I just want to know whether that grass, the 100,000-year-old grass, where is that?
It's not actually. I kind of fudged that one a tiny bit. It is around Australia, in various areas in Australia, but it's also, I think, in the Red Sea. It gets a little further beyond here than just Australia. But it's just that it makes an absurd claim that the bristlecone pine is the oldest living thing on planet Earth. But Australia's got tons of it, so we can put our hand up for that one. I don't know, actually, and I apologize not knowing more about it. And in fact, it's complicated, isn't it? Because it's probably a clone. It's probably one individual that simply keeps itself happy. Clones are great. You know, they get up in the morning, they look in the mirror, and they think, geez, you're beautiful, so they just keep cloning themselves, as opposed to those things that are reproducing by normal sexual reproduction. But nevertheless, that's the estimated age. But, you know, compared with the king's holly, and that's a tree, and we don't have any argument about it, and it's only Tasmania, which is great.
We've got a question here. That's you. Oh.
My son was wondering how the king's holly manages to survive through the ice ages.
Good question.
Really good question.
Can I ask you what your name is?
He's Jove.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and the answer is I haven't a clue. I don't know. When you keep asking that question, by the time you come to the university, that's going to be your PhD project to work that one out. I don't know. I mean, it may be possible that it was emergent through the ice. It just kept growing enough to keep on top of whatever the ice was. A lot of trees can handle ice. Trees actually, more than grass, curiously, absorb a great deal of sunlight. And I was just today, actually, I was up in Mount Field, and I was fascinated by looking at all the vegetation in the snow that was still up there. And you find every bit of vegetation has been pulling in solar radiation, and all of the snow is melting and pulling back from those trees. So it may be the tree itself is a kind of a self-protecting device in a cold climate. I'm not sure. Good question.
Good question. Got another question.
Why are animals now smaller than they have been historically?
Well, the blue whale is the biggest creature anybody's ever heard of, and it's on planet Earth now. There's that tree. Nobody's ever seen a bigger tree than Eucalyptus regnans. So you'd have to say that the size of animals cycles through time. It is fascinating. What you find is that when we think about animals, cold-blooded animals like reptiles, every time the global planet changes its net temperature, when it warms, the reptiles get to be huge, as in the Jurassic and the early part of the Cretaceous. And then every time it cools, all those reptiles go down in body size. Every time the temperature goes up, mammals and their ancestors all declined in size because they're cursed with body heat. They got to dump heat, so they don't like hot climates. And every time the weather cooled, the mammals got bigger. So it's these giant climate cycles through the history of Earth that are triggering some of these fluctuations of when the biggest things occurred. It's complicated.
And a final question here.
In your TED talk, you left us with the tantalising end. Watch this space and regarding technology that might advance the ability to de-extinct species.
Yep.
Where are we at now? How's that changed?
I'd love to tell you that we have these little frogs in my back pocket, but I'll just see if I can find him. You probably didn't hear the talk that I gave the other night, but I sort of reviewed the overall information we've got on it. If you want to email me, I'll give you a full explanation where it's at. The issue is we've got embryos. We've DNA tested these embryos. It's definitely the extinct frog's DNA that's producing these embryos, and that frog has been extinct for over 40 years. Non-cryoprotected material, and we've got the DNA working. So we're pretty excited about it. We think we're on the doorstep of pushing it over that line. But what happens is every time we get a ball of cells, the early stage embryo, they don't continue to develop to produce a tadpole. We worried about this for a while till we did parallel experiments working with modern frogs and found they did exactly the same thing. So we're now convinced it's the technology we're using, nothing to do with the extinct frog's DNA that's limiting it. It's something that we're doing in the way we're preparing and processing this material that's limiting the development of the embryo. That's our next challenge, is to solve that problem with living frogs, then return to the extinct frog's tissues again, and hopefully we'll have that frog back.
It's fascinating science, and in fact, Mike Archer's going to hang around tonight so you can accost him about de-extinction and many other things. So much stuff to talk about. Mike Archer, thank you so much for being here. And one thing that I'm really struck by is that I remember a French guy saying to me, I don't mind living in Australia, but the built environment's so new. Everything's so modern and new. And what I love about Europe is that it's so ancient. And I just thought, they need to talk to you. We have the ancient landscape. Let's give it up for Mike Archer.